So just over a year ago now, I recorded a quick comparison video between the Shure SM7B and the Electro-Voice RE20. And the reason why I decided to re-record this video is just because it's now been over a year and I've spent a year with both microphones. Last year when I recorded it, I had a rented RE20 and I had it for about 24 to 48 hours before I came to my conclusion about the microphone. But now, having lived with both microphones interchangeably, using them over the past year making content, I definitely now have a personal preference, and also my personal preference may not align with what I recommend. So I figured I'd just do an updated video here in 2025 just to discuss those reasons. First off, I'm just going to turn off all processing on these two microphones just so you can hear the raw audio coming out of it. So all processing is turned off. The Shure SM7B is set to 60 dB, whereas the RE20 is set to 54. So this is the raw audio sound quality coming out of the microphones. For this specific video, because my room is not sound treated, I've just literally draped blankets all around the room at the moment, and I put up a black studio backdrop just to sort of help absorb some of the reverb. Last year when I recorded my original video, I had a lot more furniture, wallpaper, picture frames and so forth, whereas this year I've got exposed concrete on my walls because I'm sort of like midway through decorating. So just to help with the reverb, I've just literally draped blankets all around me at the moment. I'm just going to quickly insert a clap test just so you can hear what the reverb sounds like with and without the blankets. Now that was an important point just to show what the difference is between when a room is sound treated and when it's not. This is technically not being sound treated. I've just actually put blankets around the place. I've got no acoustic panels and so forth. But if your goal is to achieve optimal sound quality, then you first need to look at your recording environment. As you can see, simply just draping blankets around me has actually impacted the audio massively. But you'd assume, looking into top-end microphones, that the goal would be for sound quality, but that's not entirely true. Now, first off, I do own both microphones. I have no intention of selling either. I plan on keeping them both within my collection. And I do find myself preferring either or depending on my mood and depending on the time and what I'm creating. But what I would say for most people, the recommendation that I would give to them is the Shure SM7B. Now, it's an easy assumption to think that if you're looking to a top-end microphone, you're going for the most optimal sound. But that's unfortunately not always the case. Because a lot of people now are creating content for social media, the look of the microphone does play a huge factor. Take a look at the Diary of a CEO as an example. If you actually listen to their podcast, you wouldn't know too much of a difference in terms of the sound quality for most people, that is. But if you watch the video, you'd notice that they don't use the Shure SM7Bs anymore. But again, if you look at the thumbnails, they still use the Shure SM7Bs within the thumbnails. And I believe that's because it signifies it's a high-end podcast. And most people assume this is for the high-end podcasts. And that's purely because Joe Rogan has established that market and actually solidified that this is the gold standard for podcasts because he's got the biggest podcast and this is his choice of microphone. So I began the video in the podcast studio preset. I've now removed all processing. I'm now going to go into the broadcast studio preset. The broadcast studio preset is just much more of an aggressive preset versus the podcast studio. It's way more heavy on the noise gate and compression, but you do get a bit more of a cleaner sound coming through this. When you're in an environment where it's not sound treated, you can hear it fighting against the reverb. So it's much better served actually you just treat your room as much as you can. That being said, putting the look of the microphone aside for a second, the sound quality now. Both microphones sound really good as far as I'm concerned. They have slightly different characteristics. If you've got a trained ear to both microphones, you can actually hear them quite clearly. But for your average listener, they're not really going to notice. The Shure SM7B is much more softer in tone. The word that most people use is actually more of a flat, warm sound. But I kind of feel like it's just a lot more softer. Whereas the RE20 has a lot more clarity, but with that clarity, it comes a little bit more harsh. And again, it's not really a bad thing. I sometimes prefer the sound quality of RE20. And when I'm interchangeably switching between the two microphones, it's so clear to me which one is which. The RE20 has a lot more detail in the top end and a lot rounded low end, whereas the Shure SM7B is just much more flat and it's much more soft. But that being said, because it's much more flat and soft, it's much more easier to listen to over a long period of time. So if you are creating like a long form piece of content, speaking into the Shure SM7B for a long period of time, this may be a better microphone for your audience. The other side as well, I've been switching back and forth between these two microphones over the past couple of years. And whenever I listen back to my voice in the RE20, it does sound much clearer. But it's also picking up a lot of my breathing and the sounds of my saliva. And that's not a pleasant sound for anyone to listen to. So I have to be much more conscious when I'm using this microphone about its positioning, how I speak. Whereas the Shure SM7B is just a little bit more plug and play for me. The final point I want to talk about is the Shure SM7B's price. Brand new is £349 on Amazon at the moment, whereas the RE20 is $539. So it's a significant price difference. But with the Shure SM7B, you would actually have to have another inline preamp through a cloud lifter or so forth. You can get a Shure SM7B with a built-in preamp, and at that point the cost does start creeping up closer to the £500 mark, but it's still cheaper than the RE20. If you have an audio interface which actually provides you enough clean gain, you won't need the inline preamp. I have the Rodecaster Pro 2. I've not used any other audio interface, so I can't speak and recommend on any of those, but I do find buying to the Shure SM7B here in the UK at least is much more of a cheaper option. So just in closing, I prefer the RE20 sound quality, but to anyone, if they was asked me between the two microphones, I'd probably recommend them the Shure SM7B just because it's easier to use, the sound quality is almost just as good, and overall it's just a much cheaper microphone to buy into. And in addition to that, the status of the microphone helps signify that your content is going to be a slightly more higher premium quality because you bought into a more premium microphone. This microphone is not as recognizable, whereas the Shure SM7B is much more of a widely recognized microphone. Despite the conclusion from last year's video not changing heavily, in my own personal subjective opinion, I still kind of like teetering between the 50-50 mark between the two of them, but as a general thing for now, I can actually more confidently recommend the Shure SM7B to most people. Let me know if you have any intention of buying either one of these microphones and which one you choose. Cheers for watching.